The morning sun lay warm on the deck. At 7:42 a.m., the harbor of Bridgetown, Barbados was already shrinking behind the ship, its pastel buildings dissolving into heat haze as the USS Cyclops turned her bow north. The Caribbean was calm. The sky was clear. The sea rolled gently, blue and endless in every direction. It should have been an easy voyage. A young sailor stood near the rail, watching the island fade. He was 23 years old. Like most of the men aboard, he had no reason to believe this morning was any different from the dozens that came before it. The engines beat steadily beneath his feet. The ship answered the helm. Everything felt normal. Just before noon, the Cyclops sent a routine message. Weather fair. All well. Those were the last words anyone would ever hear from her. Somewhere between Barbados and the American coast, the largest ship in the United States Navy vanished. No distress call, no wreckage, no lifeboats, not a single piece of debris, no floating planks, no cork life preservers, no bodies carried ashore by tide or current. 309 men disappeared with her. The Navy searched for weeks. Warships scoured thousands of square miles of open ocean. Radio operators called into the void again and again, waiting for an answer that never came. The Atlantic remained silent. It was as if the ship had never existed. How does a steel vessel more than 500 feet long simply cease to be? How does calm weather become catastrophe? And how does the sea take everything and return nothing at all? To understand what happened to the Cyclops, we have to go back, before the silence, before the lies, before the final voyage, to a ship that was never meant to carry what she did, and a series of decisions that quietly sealed the fate of everyone on board. This is the story of the ship that vanished. The USS Cyclops was never meant to be famous. She was not a battleship. She carried no heavy guns. She would never lead a fleet into combat. She was a collier, one of the most important and least celebrated ships in the United States Navy. At more than 500 feet long, Cyclops was enormous. When fully loaded, she displaced nearly 20,000 tons. Her job was simple in theory and vital in practice. She carried fuel, coal, the lifeblood of early 20th century naval power. In an age before oil-powered fleets, every battleship, cruiser, and destroyer depended on ships like Cyclops. Without coal, the Navy could not move. Without coal, the fleet could not fight. Without coal, the war could not be sustained. Newspapers called her a floating coal mine. Her deck was crowded with cables, winches, and massive clamshell buckets capable of lifting 2 tons of coal at a time. Alongside her, warships would steam in parallel as fuel was transferred bag by bag, bucket by bucket, sometimes in heavy seas, sometimes at night. It was dirty work, dangerous work, and absolutely essential. For 7 years, Cyclops did it without incident. She crossed the Atlantic. She supplied fleets from the Baltic to the Caribbean. She supported American operations off Mexico and delivered aid during crises no one would later remember. She was dependable, predictable, invisible, and that was the problem. Because ships that work quietly year after year inspire confidence. Confidence becomes routine. Routine becomes assumption. By 1917, the Navy trusted Cyclops completely. No one stopped to ask whether she could survive a mission she had never been designed for. No one questioned whether a ship built to haul coal could safely carry something far heavier. And no one imagined that the vessel tasked with keeping the fleet alive would soon vanish, taking her crew with her, without leaving so much as a single trace behind. The Cyclops looked indestructible. Her hull was thick steel, her frame immense. From the dock she appeared solid, immovable, more factory than ship. But beneath the waterline, her design carried a weakness that could not be seen from shore. The Cyclops had a flat bottom and a wide beam. It was a deliberate choice. This shape made her stable when carrying coal, thousands of tons stacked evenly across her holds. It allowed her to sit high, steady, and predictable in moderate seas. But the same design came with a cost. In heavy weather, flat-bottomed ships roll violently. Not the gentle rise and fall of a deep-keeled vessel, but long, terrifying swings from side to side. Sailors who served aboard the Cyclops remembered those moments vividly, the deck tilting farther than instinct said was possible, men bracing themselves, waiting to see if the ship would come back. Sometimes she rolled more than 40 degrees, on at least one occasion closer to 50. For a ship carrying thousands of tons of cargo, that kind of motion was frightening and dangerous. The crew learned to live with it. They had no choice. The Cyclops was known for her rolling, and over time, fear gave way to familiarity. The ship always righted herself. She always came back, until one day she wouldn't. Because the danger was not the roll itself. The danger was what happened inside the ship when she rolled. Cargo shifts, stress concentrates, steel bends where it was never meant to bend. As long as the weight in her holds behaved as expected, the Cyclops survived. But her margin for error was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. She was safe, right up until the moment she wasn't. The Cyclops did not carry anonymous numbers. She carried men. There were seasoned sailors aboard, but many were not. When the United States entered the war, the Navy needed bodies, quickly. Training was shortened. Experience became secondary to availability. The Cyclops received whoever could be spared. They came from farms and factories, from small towns and city streets, mechanics, laborers, salesmen, teenagers barely old enough to shave. Some had never been to sea before their enlistment. Others had never been farther from home than the next county. Among them was a ship's doctor, responsible for hundreds of lives with limited supplies. There were cooks, firemen, engineers, deckhands, men whose names would never appear in headlines, whose jobs were invisible unless something went wrong. Most were young. Many were eager. Nearly all believed they would return home. They wrote letters to their families. They spoke of warm weather, foreign ports, the monotony of shipboard life. They complained about food. They joked about the rolling seas. Nothing in those letters suggested fear, because fear requires a warning. And no warning ever came. On the morning the Cyclops left Barbados, the crew went about their duties as they always had. Watches were set, engines monitored, decks secured. There was no alarm, no sense of finality, just men doing their jobs, on a ship that would soon take them beyond the reach of memory. Every ship reflects the man who commands it. On the Cyclops, that reflection was unsettling. Lieutenant Commander George Worley had been with the ship since the beginning. He knew her systems, her rhythms, her weaknesses better than anyone alive. He walked the deck with a cane, a habit that made him appear older, more seasoned, an old salt in a navy suddenly flooded with amateurs. But to those who served under him, Worley inspired something other than confidence. He was distant, suspicious, prone to sudden anger. Discipline aboard the Cyclops was harsh but inconsistent. Minor infractions were punished severely, while serious problems were ignored. Officers avoided the captain when they could. Sailors learned to keep their heads down and their opinions to themselves. Behind his back, the crew gave him a name. They called him the Damned Dutchman. Some whispered that he was unfit to command. Others said he was simply out of his time, a relic of the merchant service unsuited to the demands of a modern navy at war. What mattered was not which explanation was true. What mattered was that trust was gone. And on a ship already burdened by design flaws and an inexperienced crew, trust was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Worley remained in command not because he was loved or even respected, but because the Navy needed experienced captains, and there were too few to go around. In wartime, competence was assumed where it could not be proven. No one removed him, no one replaced him, no one intervened. And so the Cyclops sailed with a captain her crew did not believe in, into waters where belief, judgment, and leadership would soon mean the difference between survival and silence. George Worley was not the man he claimed to be. To the United States Navy, he was an experienced American mariner, quiet, seasoned, reliable enough to command one of its largest auxiliary vessels. His papers were in order. His record appeared solid. For years, no one looked any deeper. But after the Cyclops vanished, investigators did. They discovered that George Worley did not exist. The man the crew knew as Worley had been born in Germany in 1862. His real name was Johann Friedrich Weichmann. As a teenager, he jumped ship in San Francisco and vanished into the chaos of the waterfront. Over the next 2 decades, he reinvented himself, changing his name, his accent, his story. By the time the Spanish-American War ended, Wichmann had become Worley, a naturalized American, a merchant captain, a man who understood ships and how to hide in plain sight. He ran saloons in San Francisco's Barbary Coast, a district known for violence, vice, and shadowy dealings. He brought his brothers over from Germany. He built connections in the margins of legality. Crews who served under him told stories that followed him for years, of cruelty, intimidation, and sudden rages. Sailors compared him to the most infamous captains in maritime history. Men feared him. Men hated him. And yet, when America entered the Great War, this German-born man, using an assumed name, was commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. The irony was impossible to ignore. While American soldiers were preparing to fight Germany in the trenches of Europe, a German immigrant with a hidden past stood on the bridge of an American ship, commanding 309 sailors. Some officers were uneasy, some raised concerns. But the Navy needed experienced men, and Worley knew the Cyclops better than anyone. So they accepted his word, they accepted his papers, and they accepted the risk. Behind closed doors, whispers spread through the ship. Was Worley loyal? Was he competent? Or was he something far more dangerous, a man whose past had never truly been left behind? No one could prove anything. And in wartime, uncertainty was often tolerated, until it was too late. One man would later say he saw it coming. His name was Conrad Nervig. Nervig was a young naval officer when he was assigned to the Cyclops in the summer of 1917. Like many others, he arrived eager to serve, proud to wear the uniform, and unprepared for what he would find aboard one of the Navy's most important ships. Years later, long after the Cyclops had vanished, Nervig would try to explain what it had felt like to serve under Captain Worley. By then, he was no longer a junior officer. He had built a successful career far from the sea, but the memory of the Cyclops never left him. He described Worley as gruff, eccentric, and deeply disliked, a man who carried authority without inspiring respect, a poor navigator, an overly cautious commander in some moments, and recklessly dismissive in others. According to Nervig, the ship was badly run, discipline was arbitrary, orders changed without explanation, officers avoided confrontation with the captain, sailors whispered instead of reporting problems. The result was a crew that followed orders, but did not trust the man giving them. Nervig believed that atmosphere was deadly. He later wrote that the Cyclops operated in a constant state of tension, not fear of the enemy, but fear of their own command structure. Small mistakes went uncorrected. Serious risks were tolerated. Safety depended not on procedure, but on luck. Then came the incident Nervig never forgot. During routine operations, an engine was turned over while a sailor was working nearby. The force of the propeller drew in a small boat and knocked the man into the water. He drowned before anyone could reach him. It was ruled an accident. Nervig disagreed. To him, it was proof of a deeper failure, of a ship where communication had broken down, where safety rules were ignored, and where no one felt empowered to speak up. Not long after, Nervig received transfer orders. Captain Worley tried to have them revoked. For reasons never fully explained, the attempt failed. Nervig left the Cyclops behind. Alive, he would spend the rest of his life wondering why he had been spared, and what became of the men he left on that deck. In January 1918, the Cyclops was given a new assignment. She was to sail south to Brazil, deliver coal to American patrol ships, and return to the United States carrying a cargo deemed essential to the war effort, manganese ore. Manganese was critical. It strengthened steel. It hardened armor. Without it, shells cracked, weapons failed, and factories slowed. The demand was urgent, and the Cyclops, large, available, and trusted, was chosen to bring it home. On paper, the mission was routine. In reality, it was anything but. Coal and manganese behave very differently. Coal is relatively light. It stacks predictably. Sailors aboard the Cyclops had spent years learning how to load it safely, how to balance the ship, how to distribute weight, how to compensate for shifting seas. Manganese ore was another matter entirely. It was far denser than coal, more than twice the weight by volume. It placed immense strain on the hull. It changed the ship's center of gravity. And if it was not loaded and secured correctly, it could shift suddenly and catastrophically. This was not speculation. The risks were known. The Cyclops had been designed to carry coal, not dense metallic ore. Doing so safely required experience, careful calculations, and strict supervision. There was only one officer aboard who had that experience, and he would not be present when the cargo was loaded. As the Cyclops prepared to take on manganese in Rio de Janeiro, the mission quietly crossed an invisible line from dangerous to fatal. As the Cyclops prepared to load manganese ore in Rio de Janeiro, something extraordinary happened. Captain Worley placed his executive officer, the second in command, under arrest. The charge was never fully explained. Contemporary accounts describe it as a trivial dispute, the kind of disagreement that would normally be settled behind closed doors. But Worley did not settle it quietly. He confined the executive officer to his quarters, and with that decision, the one man aboard who understood how to properly load manganese ore was removed from the process entirely. Loading coal had always been routine. The crew knew the rhythms, they knew the patterns. They had done it hundreds of times before. Manganese was different. It required careful distribution across the holds. Weight needed to be spread evenly from bow to stern. Ballast had to be adjusted constantly. Even small mistakes could place enormous stress on the ship's structure. But now, the men overseeing the operation had never handled manganese before. They did what they knew. They loaded it the way they had always loaded coal. By the time the Cyclops finished taking on cargo, she carried nearly 11,000 tons of dense metallic ore, much of it concentrated amidships, where the ship was already under the greatest structural strain. There were no alarms, no official protests, no written objections that survived. The ship sat lower in the water than it ever had before, and still no one stopped the process, because on the Cyclops, authority flowed in one direction. Orders were not questioned, disagreements were punished, and the consequences of a captain's anger would not be felt by him alone. When the executive officer was finally released, the damage had already been done. The cargo was aboard, the balance was wrong, and the fate of the ship had quietly shifted. The Cyclops should never have sailed in the condition she was in. Before leaving Brazil, engineers discovered a serious problem in the ship's propulsion system. One of her two main engines, the starboard engine, was damaged. A cylinder was cracked. The machinery was no longer reliable. For a ship already overloaded and poorly balanced, it was a dangerous development. With both engines functioning, the Cyclops could at least correct her course quickly. She could counter heavy seas. She could respond if the ship began to list. Redundancy was her safety margin. Now, half of that margin was gone. The damage was reported up the chain of command. The situation was reviewed, and then a decision was made. The Cyclops would sail anyway. The reasoning was simple and chillingly familiar. Repairs would take time. Dry docks were scarce. The manganese was urgently needed. The ship could still move under her remaining engine. On paper, the risk was acceptable. In reality, it was compounded. With only one engine, the Cyclops had less maneuverability, less ability to fight heavy seas, less capacity to correct a sudden list caused by shifting cargo. Any failure, no matter how small, would now have consequences the crew could not outrun. But no one ordered her to stay. No one delayed the voyage. No one reduced the cargo. No one reconsidered the earlier decisions that had already placed the ship in danger. Because responsibility was spread thin and urgency pressed hard. A single cracked engine did not seem like enough to stop a ship this large, so the paperwork was filed, the risk was accepted, and the Cyclops prepared to sail north, overloaded, imbalanced, and now half-blind. The Cyclops reached Barbados on March 3, 1918. The stop was not planned. Officially, the ship reported a shortage of coal. Unofficially, something was wrong. Observers on the pier noticed it immediately. The Cyclops was riding low in the water, far lower than expected. Her plimsoll line, the mark that indicated a safe load, was nearly submerged. To experienced eyes, it was unmistakable. The ship was overloaded. When the American consul came aboard, he was troubled by what he saw. The vessel's condition raised questions that demanded answers. Captain Worley provided them. He claimed the ship was short on fuel. He requested additional coal. The explanation did not align with the visible evidence, but it was accepted. There was no formal inspection, no demand that the cargo be shifted, no order to offload weight. Time was short. The war waited for no one. While in port, Worley purchased unusually large quantities of food and supplies, more than necessary for a routine voyage. To some, it looked like caution. To others, it looked like preparation. For what? No one could say. By the morning of March 4th, the Cyclops was ready to depart. Fresh coal had been taken aboard. The cargo remained untouched. The cracked engine remained unrepaired. As the ship eased away from the dock, nothing appeared outwardly wrong. The sea was calm, the weather fair, the horizon open. At 7:42 a.m., Captain Worley sent his final message. Weather fair. All well. It was a lie, or a misunderstanding, or the last routine signal of a ship already past the point of rescue. Within days, the Cyclops would fail to arrive. Within weeks, hope would fade. And within months, her disappearance would become one of the greatest unsolved losses in U.S. naval history. Barbados had been the last chance to stop her. No one did. The Cyclops was expected in Baltimore within days. At first, no one was concerned. Ships ran late all the time. Weather delayed schedules. Mechanical problems slowed progress. In wartime, uncertainty was normal, and patience was assumed. So when the Cyclops failed to appear on the horizon, clerks marked her arrival as overdue. Nothing more. Hours turned into days. Still, no alarm was raised. The Atlantic was vast. Radio silence was not unusual. Somewhere out there, the ship was surely working her way north, but as days stretched into a week, unease began to spread. Families waited for letters that did not arrive. Dock workers scanned the harbor for a silhouette that never came. Naval offices began making quiet inquiries, checking logs, reviewing routes, asking questions no one wanted to ask aloud. Had she diverted? Had she turned back? Had something gone wrong? No answers came. Only then did the Navy begin to understand what silence meant. The Cyclops was not late. She was missing. Search orders were drafted. Ships were redirected. Radios crackled with calls into empty seas. The weight of the realization settled slowly, painfully. A vessel this large does not simply disappear. And yet, the ocean offered nothing in return. The Navy did not search blindly. Once the Cyclops was declared missing, the response was immediate and massive. Warships were dispatched. Patrol aircraft scanned the sea below. Merchant vessels were instructed to watch for wreckage, lifeboats, or survivors clinging to debris. The search area expanded day by day. Thousands of square miles of open ocean were covered. Shipping lanes were retraced. Currents were calculated. Winds were analyzed. Every plausible route between Barbados and the American coast was examined in painstaking detail. Nothing was found. No oil slicks, no floating cargo, no splintered timbers, no overturned boats. Not even the smallest fragment of wreckage surfaced. This absence was not reassuring. It was terrifying. Ships sink all the time. Even in deep water, they leave something behind. Wood floats, cork rises, lifeboats break free. The sea almost always gives clues. But the ocean gave nothing back. As days turned into weeks, the reality became unavoidable. Whatever had happened to the Cyclops had happened quickly, completely. So completely that 309 men and a ship the length of 5 football fields had been erased in silence. The search was eventually called off, not because the mystery was solved, but because there was nothing left to search for. When a ship disappears without a trace, the mind searches for an enemy. For the families of the missing and for a nation at war, the idea that the Cyclops had simply failed was almost unbearable. There had to be a reason, a culprit, someone to blame. Attention quickly turned to Captain Worley. His German birth, once an overlooked detail, now took on a darker meaning. Rumors spread that he had defected, that he had deliberately sailed the ship into enemy hands, that the Cyclops had been captured, or worse, handed over. Others blamed German submarines. U-boats prowled the Atlantic in 1918, sinking merchant ships with ruthless efficiency. It was easy to imagine the Cyclops torpedoed in secret, her crew lost in an instant. The theory gained traction because it was comforting. Enemy action made sense. Enemy action absolved mistakes. Enemy action spared the Navy from looking inward. But when investigators followed the evidence, the theory collapsed. German naval records were meticulous. Every U-boat patrol was logged. Every torpedo fired was accounted for. After the war, those records were examined in detail. None placed a submarine anywhere near the Cyclops route. None reported an engagement matching her disappearance. None claimed the sinking of a ship even remotely resembling her size. There was no enemy attack. As for Worley, no trace of him ever surfaced. No sightings, no communications, no evidence that he survived longer than anyone else aboard. The treason theory failed because it relied on drama instead of facts. What destroyed the Cyclops was not an external enemy. It was something far more unsettling. A chain of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people inside a system that never stopped itself. When the Navy set superstition aside, a quieter explanation remained. One without drama, without enemies, without a single moment of explosion or fire. It began with the cargo. The manganese ore aboard the Cyclops was not evenly distributed. Much of it sat amidships, where stress on the hull was already greatest. The ship's flat-bottom design amplified that stress every time she rolled. Each swell bent steel beams back and forth, again and again. Over time, metal weakens. Investigators later discovered that ships of the Cyclops class were prone to structural fatigue. Their internal framing could crack under uneven loads, especially when carrying cargo they had never been designed to haul. Now, add the final elements: a cracked engine, reduced maneuverability, an overloaded hull riding dangerously low in the water. At some point, perhaps in moderate seas, perhaps without warning, the manganese shifted. Just slightly. Enough to change the balance, enough to concentrate stress on a single structural point. Steel failed. The ship likely broke amidships. If that happened, there would have been no time to react, no chance to send a distress call, no opportunity to lower lifeboats. The Cyclops would have folded inward and sunk in minutes, dragging her crew down with her. That scenario explains everything: why there was no wreckage, why there were no survivors, why the disappearance was total. It was not a mystery of forces beyond human understanding. It was the result of design limits ignored, warnings dismissed, and risks accepted one after another, until nothing remained to absorb the final failure. The sea did not need to be violent. It only needed time. For years, the loss of the Cyclops stood alone, a single catastrophe, a singular mystery, a tragedy without context. Then it happened again. In 1941, more than 2 decades later, 2 ships nearly identical to the Cyclops vanished within months of each other. Their names were Proteus and Nereus. They were sister ships, built to the same design, with the same flat-bottom hull, the same internal framing, the same limitations hidden beneath layers of steel and paint. And like the Cyclops, they were carrying manganese ore. The Proteus disappeared in November 1941. The Nereus followed in December. Both ships were sailing the same general waters. Both were heavily loaded. Both sent routine signals. Then nothing. No distress calls, no wreckage, no survivors. By then, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 ships, 3 disappearances, all built the same way, all carrying the same cargo. The ocean had not changed. The ships had. What once seemed like an isolated mystery now looked like something far more disturbing. A flaw repeated again and again until it finally revealed itself through absence. The loss of the Cyclops had not been a singular tragedy. It had been a warning. When facts end, stories begin. The disappearance of the Cyclops left a vacuum, one filled not with answers, but with imagination. A ship gone without wreckage, a crew vanished without witnesses, an ocean that refused to explain itself. For some, the truth was too ordinary to accept. Over time, the Cyclops became something else entirely. Her name was pulled into a growing collection of disappearances, ships, aircraft, rumors, linked together not by evidence but by geography. The Bermuda Triangle. In popular books and magazines, the story was reshaped. Compasses spun wildly, storms appeared from nowhere, ships were swallowed whole by unseen forces. The sea itself became the villain. The myth endured because it was dramatic, because it was unknowable, because it required no accountability. A mysterious force was easier to accept than human error, easier than flawed designs, easier than decisions made under pressure and never questioned again. But myths do not honor the dead. They distract from the truth that nothing supernatural was required to destroy the Cyclops. No curse, no anomaly, no unseen hand beneath the waves, only steel pushed beyond its limits, only warnings ignored, only silence where responsibility should have been. The legend grew because the ship left no trace, but the absence of evidence was not evidence of the impossible. It was evidence of failure. When the searching stopped, the waiting did not. For the families of the Cyclops, there were no bodies to bury, no wreckage to touch, no grave to stand beside and grieve. Only absence, and the quiet hope that somehow, somewhere, the sea had made a mistake. Letters stopped coming. Mothers kept rooms unchanged. Wives delayed remarriage. Fathers read and reread the last words their sons had written, searching for meaning that was never meant to be there. The Navy eventually declared the men lost at sea. It was an administrative act, necessary, final. For the families, it explained nothing. 309 names were entered into records, 309 lives reduced to a line on a page. No headstones, no dates of death, just a single phrase repeated again and again. Presumed lost. As years passed, the world moved on. Wars ended, new wars began. The Cyclops became a footnote, then a rumor, then a myth. But the men aboard her were not myths. They were sons who never returned, brothers who never aged, fathers whose children grew up without them. They vanished without witness, and for that reason, they were easy to forget. Remembering them now is not about solving a Pawnee mystery. It is about restoring what silence took away. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, the Cyclops may still rest. If she does, she lies broken, her steel frame folded inward, her cargo scattered across the seabed, her name slowly disappearing beneath layers of silt and time. No marker tells passing ships what rests below them, no signal rises from the deep, only absence. Technology may one day find her, sonar may trace her outline, cameras may glimpse what remains of her hull, but discovery will not change what happened, it will not bring the men home. What endures is not the mystery, but the lesson. That ships are only as strong as the decisions made for them, that warning signs ignored do not disappear. That silence is not proof of fate, but often the result of human choice. The Cyclops did not vanish because the sea was cruel or unknowable. She vanished because no one stopped her. If this story is worth remembering, it is because those men deserve more than silence.